earth stand around him, with Banghurst massed modestly but resolutely in the rear. The grouping is oddly apposite. Occluding much of Banghurst, and looking with a pensive speculation expression at Filmer, stands the Lady Mary Elkinghorn, still beautiful in spite of the breath of scandal and her 38 years, the only person whose face does not admit a perception of the camera that was in the act of snapping them all. So much for the exterior facts of the story, but after all they are very exterior facts. About the real interest of the business one is necessarily very much in the dark. How was Filmer feeling at the time? How much was a certain unpleasant anticipation present inside that very new and fashionable frock coat? He was in the halfpenny, penny sixpenny, and more expensive papers alike, and acknowledged by the whole world as the greatest discoverer of this or any age. He had invented a practicable flying machine, and every day down among the Surrey hills the life-sized model was getting ready. And when it was ready, it followed as a clear, inevitable consequence of his having invented and made it. Everybody in the world, indeed, seemed to take it for granted. There wasn't a gap anywhere in that serried front of anticipation, that he would proudly and cheerfully get aboard it, ascend with it, and fly. But we know now pretty clearly that simple pride and cheerfulness in such an act were singularly out of harmony with Filmer's private constitution. It occurred to no one at the time, but there the fact is. We can guess with some confidence now that it must have been drifting about in his mind a great deal during the day, and from a little note to his physician complaining of persistent insomnia, we have the soundest reason for supposing it dominated his nights. The idea that it would be, after all, in spite of his theoretical security, an abominably sickening, uncomfortable, and dangerous thing for him to flap about in nothingness 1,000 feet or so in the air. It must have dawned upon him quite early in the period of being the greatest discoverer of this or any age, the vision of doing this and that with an extensive void below. Perhaps somewhere in his youth he had looked down a great height, or fallen down in some excessively uncomfortable way. Perhaps some habit of sleeping on the wrong side had resulted in that disagreeable falling nightmare one knows, and given him his horror. Of the strength of that horror there remains now not a particle of doubt. Apparently he had never weighed this duty of flying in his earlier days of research. The machine had been his end, but now things were opening out beyond his end, and particularly this giddy whirl up above there. He was a discoverer, and he had discovered, but he was not a flying man, and it was only now that he was beginning to perceive clearly that he was expected to fly. Yet, however much the thing was present in his mind, he gave no expression to it until the very end, and meanwhile he went to and fro from Banghurst's magnificent laboratories, and was interviewed and lionized, and wore good clothes, and ate good food, and lived in an elegant flat, enjoying a very abundant feast of such good, coarse, wholesome fame and success as a man, starved for all his years as he had been starved, might reasonably expected to enjoy. After a time the weekly gatherings in Fulham ceased. The model had failed one day just for a moment to respond to Filmer's guidance, or he had been distracted by the compliments of an archbishop. At any rate, it suddenly dug its nose into the air just a little too steeply as the archbishop was sailing through a Latin quotation for all the world like an archbishop in a book, and it came down in the Fulham road, within 3 yards of a bus horse. It stood for a second, perhaps, astonishing, and in its attitude, astonished. Then it crumpled, shivered into pieces, and the bus horse was incidentally killed. Filmer lost the end of the archiepiscopal compliment. He stood up and stared as his invention swooped out of sight and reach of him. His long white hands still gripped his useless apparatus. The archbishop followed his skyward gaze with an apprehension unbecoming in an archbishop. Then came the crash and the shouts and uproar from the road to relieve Filmer's tension. "My God!" he whispered, and sat down. Everyone else almost was staring to see where the machine had vanished, or rushing into the house. The making of the big machine progressed all the more rapidly for this. Over its making presided Filmer, always a little slow and very careful in his manner, always with a growing preoccupation in his mind. His care over the strength and soundness of the apparatus was prodigious. The slightest doubt, and he delayed everything until the doubtful part could be replaced. Wilkinson, his senior assistant, fumed at some of these delays, which he insisted were for the most part unnecessary. Banghurst magnified the patient certitude of Filmer in the new paper, and reviled it bitterly to his wife. And MacAndrew, the second assistant, approved Filmer's wisdom. "We're not wanting a fiasco man," said MacAndrew. "He's perfectly well advised." And whenever an opportunity arose, Filmer would expound to Wilkinson and MacAndrew just exactly how every part of the flying machine was to be controlled and worked, so that in effect they would be just as capable, and even more capable, when at last the time came, of guiding it through the skies. Now, I should imagine that if Filmer had seen fit at this stage to define just what he was feeling, and to take a definite line in the matter of his ascent, he might have escaped that painful ordeal quite easily. If he had had it clearly in his mind, he could have done endless things. He would surely have found no difficulty with a specialist to demonstrate a weak heart, or something gastric or pulmonary to stand in his way. That is the line I am astonished he did not take. Or he might, had he been man enough, have declared simply and finally that he did not intend to do the thing. But the fact is, though the dread was hugely present in his mind, the thing was by no means sharp and clear. I fancy that all through this period he kept telling himself that when the occasion came he would find himself equal to it. He was like a man just gripped by a great illness who says he feels a little out of sorts and expects to be better presently. Meanwhile he delayed the completion of the machine, and let the assumption that he was going to fly it take root and flourish exceedingly about him. He even accepted anticipatory compliments on his courage. And, barring this secret squeamishness, there can be no doubt he found all the praise and distinction and fuss he got a delightful and even intoxicating draught. The Lady Mary Elkinghorn made things a little more complicated for him. How that began was a subject of inexhaustible speculation to Hicks. Probably in the beginning she was just a little nice to him with that impartial partiality of hers, and it may be that to her eyes, standing out conspicuously as he did ruling his monster in the upper air, he had a distinction that Hicks was not disposed to find. And somehow they must have had a moment of sufficient isolation, and the great discoverer a moment of sufficient courage, for something just a little personal to be mumbled or blurted. However it began, there is no doubt that it did begin, and presently became quite perceptible to a world accustomed to find in the proceedings of the Lady Mary Elkinghorn a matter of entertainment. It complicated things, because the state of love in such a virgin mind as Filmer's would brace his resolution, if not sufficiently, at any rate considerably, towards facing a danger he feared, and hampered him in such attempts at evasion as would otherwise be natural and congenial. It remains a matter for speculation just how the Lady Mary felt for Filmer, and just what she thought of him. At 38 one may have gathered much wisdom and still be not altogether wise, and the imagination still functions actively enough in creating glamours and effecting the impossible. He came before her eyes as a very central man, and that always counts, and he had powers, unique powers as it seemed, at any rate in the air. The performance with the model had just a touch of the quality of a potent incantation, and women have never displayed an unreasonable disposition to imagine that when a man has powers he must necessarily have power. Given so much, and what was not good in Filmer's manner and appearance became an added merit. He was modest, he hated display, but given an occasion where true qualities are needed, then one would see. The late Mrs. Bampton thought it wise to convey to Lady Mary her opinion that Filmer, all things considered, was rather a grub. "He's certainly not a sort of